Welcome to the Homeschool Together podcast. Where one working mom and a stay-at-home dad help you navigate the nuts and bolts of the growing and dynamic world of homeschooling.
With a focus on early learners, like me.
All the ins and outs of building and maintaining your homeschool life.
Homeschool.
Find out tips and tricks to make things like this easier.
I'm reading.
And ultimately, enjoy educating your kids. And what's that last thing?
Have fun together. Did I do good, Daddy?
Yeah, you did, sweetie. Good job.
Hello and welcome back to Homeschool Together. Thank you for joining the number one podcast in the world.
I love all these self-proclaimed accolades.
We're the hottest podcast on Mars right now. A lot of homeschooling with the green guys. Ariel, people who live in the about region of North Puget Sound, where would they see two yahoos talk about homeschool?
Yes, so June 21st.
June 21st.
I believe it's 4 p.m. Is that right?
2 to 4.
2 to 4 p.m. We will be at the Snohomish Library in the city of Snohomish.
I went there because they put the posters out.
Oh.
And I was scouting. I was looking around.
Oh, yeah, we need pictures of our posters.
The girls were like, Daddy, what are you doing? I'm like, leave Daddy alone. I'm looking for my poster.
We're pretty excited. We're going to talk about just beginning homeschool stuff, but obviously we would love to have a great turnout, and we're going to stay after and we'll answer questions and chit chat and things. So yeah, come on down. Let's chat homeschool. Even if you're not just a beginner, we would love to meet up with you and
Absolutely.
talk homeschool. We love talking homeschool.
Absolutely. So today we're going to be wrapping up the testing series, and today we're going to be talking about what to do in the test. And it's very funny. My daughter was asking me this very question today because I was bringing it up. I was like, "Hey, yeah, you're going to be taking your test in a month or so. It's very similar to what you're doing." She got a little nervous. She was like, "Daddy, a lot of questions. How do I do this? What's it going to be like?" So very, very topical discussion, right?
Today. This is true. All my research is going to come in handy, huh?
Yeah, like all the questions of, what is it like? How do you take this test? What am I going to experience? And all that type of stuff is, I think, really, really important, information. I think our young learners would want to know when they're getting into this test. Yeah,
we've covered, why testing can be an important tool, and you may have to test for your state, or you may just want to test, or you may be having an older learner who is going to be doing SATs or whatever. Yep. We talked about all the materials that you could use and how to prepare for the test. So now it's game day. Yeah. Now it's time to go. So we wanted to talk through, you're sitting there. I've taken a couple, we've both taken big tests, but I've taken a couple of massive, 8-hour professional exams. And these are the very types of strategies that I used. And so I think, obviously, we didn't write the test, whatever test it is you're taking. So these are kind of just general, take it with a grain of salt, but they're good things to train our learners in so that when they see a test, they can kind of know the types of questions and how to approach. So that's the first thing. There's a lot of different question types.
Yeah, I think the one that our learners are probably going to see the most, probably right up front, is a multiple choice. Understanding multiple choice. If they're going to see that, if they're going to see any type of free response, maybe some type of essay or paragraph-like writing, they'll want to be able to know what that looks like as well. There may be some type of kind of math elements, so they may have to use a calculator or some type of scratch paper type of element. I know on some of my tests that I've taken, I've had to use a whiteboard that I have to turn in at the end so that they can examine it, and I'm not allowed to erase anything on that whiteboard. It's kind of like a binder of whiteboard pages that I would have to turn in at the end so that they can verify what I've written and whatnot. So I don't think in our students, experience, they're going to be seeing anything of that. I've been actually very surprised at I'm sure there are a million ways of people have and tried to cheat in the past, and they try to protect as much as possible. But I think for the most part, our kids are probably going to see some type of essay, a lot of multiple choice, and maybe some type of calculator needs for whatever they're going to do with math.
each of these question types, let's just kind of go one by one and how to approach. So your multiple choice, like you said, that's going to be your standard Scantron. So I don't know if Scantron's still the thing, but the bubbles, right? So the strategy with all multiple choice is to read all the options, eliminate your wrong answers, and then make an educated guess if you need to. That's just kind of your standard way to go through multiple choice. You're also going to have true, false. You're going to really want to look for keywords like always or never. This is also the case with multiple choice. Usually absolute statements like that indicate false statements.
Yeah.
So false statements, if it's a true, false, or if it's on a multiple choice, always and never are usually, they're so absolute that oftentimes those are not the right answers. That's not always. I used always, but that's one thing to look for. You talked about the short answer essays. So this is a whole thing in of itself, but in basic, you want to start with an outline.
Yeah.
Right. Initially, it's usually the 5-part, right? You tell them what you're going to tell them. You tell them in 3 parts, and then you tell them what you told them.
Exactly.
So that's usually your standard 5-part essay.
Yep.
No matter if it's short or long, it's usually 5 basic parts. Unless you just have to write like a paragraph. And of course, our younger learners are not going to have to write this much, but always an outline, even if they're not writing anything super long. If it's not super long, they don't have to actually write down the outline. They could just have an outline in their head, but you always want to think through what you're going to write on an essay question before you start writing it, because it's sometimes you have to write in pen or you don't have time to erase and recalibrate your thoughts. You really have to think it through.
The horror of writing an essay and not having Grammarly there to help you.
Right.
I can tell you what that makes you freeze for a moment. Yeah.
Always try your best to use keywords from the question in the essay answer. So that's really important. It just makes it really easy for the grading, and it's like, oh, yep, they got all the buzzwords.
Especially if it's a higher level, you may need to know the difference between an expository essay and maybe a persuasive essay as well, because they may ask you little, and it just changes how you approach, your wording that you use. But just know the difference between those, I think, is just an important ththing. I know I had to write.
That's for your older. If you got a high schooler that's
high
taking
schooler
tests.
would probably need to know that, but I think for elementary, I don't think they need to know that as well at all.
For math problems, you talked about doing calculations. You always want to show your work, double check your calculations. And the biggest one is look for answer choices that just don't make sense, right? They're not even in the ballpark of where your answer should be. And this is a whole thing to coach for, and probably a whole separate podcast about how to teach math so that you can recognize when something is, in the zone or not even in the zone, right? Of what the magnitude of your answer should be. Which I think is a great skill if we can teach our kids. I never learned that when I was younger, and it wasn't until I got to college I finally started learning the magnitude game. Like, just looking at this problem, it couldn't possibly be this one. And a lot of that gets into decimal place values that they'll try to trick you on standardized tests. And if you know the rough magnitude of it, you may not even have to do the calculation, because maybe like all the answers are the same, but they just have decimal places that have been moved. You could know the right answer just from that. So getting the magnitude, if you can start to teach that, is really important. Like what obviously can't be the answer.
Also understanding the answer you've put in, if it is something that is realistic. Like my daughter today she was doing some type of mental math where she had to do multiplication. It was something like, I don't know, like 6 times 26 or something like that, right? And they were doing the grouping method where you would multiply, by the tens and then by the ones, and then you would add them together. And she had a number, I think it was something, maybe it was like 6 times 42, and she wrote 31. And I was like, look at that answer. Is that an answer that you would expect? Like,
exactly.
If you're talking about multiplying something 6 times, that means you're adding that number 6 times in a row. How can your answer be less than the number you're adding? Just if you did it once. And she kind of looked at it and goes, "Oh, that's not right." I said, "Yeah, but you put it down. You went with it, and then you went to the next problem. And you need to spend just like a half second or a second to say, is this look right? Does it look right? Or did I maybe make a mistake, or does this make sense?" That's a skill I think is very difficult to teach.
It is.
And that's something that, you'll hear people telling seasoned, mathematicians and whatnot, are you checking your answers? Is this a realistic thing? So it's not something that, we expect them to master early on, but it's definitely something we want them to consider and start to think about. It's one of, without having to go to sports analogies.
Oh my gosh, we're only like 10 minutes into this.
I'm not going there. But there are a lot of things that people teach people or tell people to do. Like, for example, show your work.
Yeah.
Even just annotating, like something I'm doing right now with my youngest is we're doing some inequalities, right? So it's like 5 plus 2, blank 6, and which one's greater, right? And you could do the math in your head and stuff, but sometimes, just writing the answer above it real quick allows you, to say, okay, I've got the answer here. Now I can compare the two without having to hold a lot of things in your head. My oldest does this all the time. She's always trying to balance like 3 or 4 addition problems in her brain and then like assembles it into an answer. And somewhere along the way, place values are lost, zeros are dropped or gained, and the answer goes wrong. And so a lot of these are skills of just being like, if you're just methodical about it, and I know being methodical can also be tedious, but tedium is I think in math and some of these problems is the key to success, because it's like you can depend on it. It's like it's the crutch you're allowed to have to get through. Just writing your answers down. Like even me, I've done a lot of high level math. I will still work out every step of an algebraic equation just because I know that's the right way to do it, and I'm not going to make a mistake because I can see it. And if I did get an answer that doesn't look right, I can work back and go, oh, there was my mistake. And then I can work again. Teaching young ones to do that is a great set of skills that I think can help them not just in their regular math and whatnot, but also in a test taking situation where they are relying on performance and they don't have the time.
Especially multi-step calculations.
Exactly.
I did that all through engineering school as well, which was just, you write down every step, even if you could do it in your head.
I'm seeing that a lot more now that the math problems are getting more complex. Now that we're into, I think, 5th grade math now, they're asking her to do multi-step, like just word problems. They're multi-step word problems. It's like, oh, calculate 15% of this number. And then what was my change if I paid with 100, right? You're thinking inside your head, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 math problems separate that are needed to get to that answer. It's like, here are all these steps you have to do. And knowing the flow and keeping that all in your head, you got to write it all down. But I'm literally staring at my 9-year-old, and she's just looking at the answer like she's like, I don't know,
working it
all in her head and trying to go, and then she writes an answer. Like, you don't have to do that. You can write it down. I'm not penalizing you.
Right.
And literally your dad is telling you to do it that way, and you're just not doing it. There's a little stubbornness there that I got to work through. But being able to have those skills and bring those into the test, I think are invaluable, especially when having that confidence to know that, I got the right answer.
Yep, absolutely. The last thing we wanted to say about questions is that they love to use trick questions. And so I think it would be a great idea to find some examples from the type of test that your child will be doing and look at like some common trick question type things that they might pull, just so that they can be on the lookout for, they might do something like this. Yeah,
like when they drop a not, like it is, what are the things that are not this thing, and I always try to emphasize to my daughter, like, you got to really pay attention to the language and the wording, because if you drop one word, it could change the whole thing. And you know what, you're right, they're going to put that opposite answer into the key. And so you're going to think, I got the right answer. But in fact, you screwed up on understanding what the problem is. And then they got you, right? And that type of thing. It's not even like they're tricking you, that they know if you miss the one word, that is the key or the hinge of the problem, whether it's a reading question or a math question, they're going to get you there in the multiple choice, because you're going to feel confident. That's exactly the right answer. Great. I'm going to mark that. Yeah.
Exactly.
I want to try to avoid those things and really read slowly and methodically through your problems.
It's true. So the next big section we wanted to talk about is managing your time effectively. And having taken, like I said, a couple of big 8-hour exams, I can tell you that time management is huge, especially if you're sitting for a big test. If you've got a teenager sitting for the SATs or something, time management's big. So the keys to doing this, and the way that I did my professional exams too, you want to skim through the whole test first, kind of gauge the difficulty, gauge what kind of questions you've got. Just fill your brain up with, okay, here's the kind of the easier ones, the harder ones, whatever. Start with your easiest questions. It's easiest to do that. I would go through the whole test and I'd be like, I know this one right away. And I would work the answer out, boom, go on to the next one. Go ahead and pace yourself through. If you get to a question that's go through all the easies first, then start on the next kind of level of difficulty question, assuming that you're not going to lose your place, right? So sometimes what I would do is I'd go through like all the easy ones in a section, especially if the test is very long. I'd go like first 20 questions, and I would just go and hit all the easy questions there, and then I would do the mediums. And then once I got to questions that were harder, I knew were going to take more time, I would just star them and come back to them later. So that by maybe 3/4 of the way through the test or halfway through the test or whatever, I've done all the easies, all the medium ones I totally knew how to do. They took a little more time. And then I'm at the hard ones that I'm not really sure how to do. So once you get to the hard ones, you're going to take a few minutes, see if you can try to figure it out. If you can't, you might go on to another one of the quote unquote harder ones, and start to work your way through. And then in your last few minutes, if you can go back and try to get those hard ones, if there's no penalty for wrong answers, then just make a guess. If you have time left over, if your student has time, try to review your answers as best you can. So what I would always do is, if I had, I had a test booklet that had it was all multiple choice, and then I had my Scantron sheet. What I would do is in the test booklet, whatever the answer was, I would circle it, and then I would transpose it onto the Scantron sheet. So that meant that I would try to reserve the last 5 to 10 minutes of the exam to go question by question and check that what I circled in the book is what was bubbled on the Scantron. Because if you get off by one line, then all of your answers are wrong. So definitely we need to teach our students to take those last few minutes to go ahead and verify their answers if it's a really important exam.
Yeah, and I know a lot of the online tests now have the ability to what you kind of said is star or bookmark a question. And I think that's so important. If you have a learner who is going into a question and they're torn between an answer, I think make your best educated guess. Don't burn extra cycles. Star it and move on.
Right.
I can't tell you how many times I've, just recently I've taken 15, 16 exams, and I've used this exact method where you go in there and you go, I'm just a little uncertain about what this answer was, but I'm going to give my best answer. I think it is. I'm going to star it and I'm going to move on. And then when I finish the exam, hopefully I have some extra time. Most of the time I did. I would go back and only hit those ones that I know, especially if you are crunched for time. So you can imagine, hey, I got a 90-minute test or a 60-minute test, and I've starred about 5 of the 50 questions, and I have 10 minutes left. You're not going to go every single question and go through those. What you're going to do is you're going to go back to those starred ones first.
Yep, exactly.
Double check those and say, do I feel confident? Because here's kind of the funny thing, a little dirty secret sometimes, is that sometimes you will get the answer to that question later because they will actually use the same terms or phrase the answer to something in a question later on. And sometimes I will immediately harken back to that. And I may even pause and go right back to it and say, I now know it's this one. And then I'll unstart and move on. Sometimes you will get those cues and those pieces of evidence there. But yeah, using the starred method, especially on the online test, is the best. And then going through and just double checking your answers. I know a lot of times when you have these multiple choice questions, I really like it when if I know it, that you don't have to waste your time and go back to that, because you're right. A lot of times you do only have so much time, and you cannot waste it going through 50 questions. And because a lot of times some of these questions, you may have to read an entire passage to do that. Like I took the one exam, and it was I would have to read a passage, and then I would have to answer 6 questions that pertained to that passage. If your test is broken up into those types of sections where you may have a passage like an English language thing where they'll give you some, short story or something, and they're going to ask your learner, what is the topic sentence? What were the characteristics of this character? What was the conflict, or what was the order of events, and things of that nature. They may, at the end of that section where they've done all 6 of those questions, they may then go and review those questions if they have a starred one, and then move on. Because if you go on to another section, and you have to then come back, you may have to read that entire passage to remember what the context was. So maybe, educate them that sometimes tests are broken into sections, especially reading tests that require students to read sections of text. They're going to bundle questions, and then you may want to have kind of like an early or mid-level review where they go back and hit that question they were a little uncertain on before they move on. And I think at that point, if you've done that review and you've done your assessment and you move on, it's done. You did your best you could do on that section, move on, because it's a low probability you're going to have enough time to come back, read, a 5-minute, section of text and then hit those questions again. I don't know if you're going to have enough time for that.
Yeah, I think that's all really good points. And I like the idea that you gave of making an educated guess on the ones that you bookmark, rather than just going on in case you did run out of time. At least it wasn't left blank.
You got an answer.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. So the next section we wanted to talk about is really strategies for staying focused and keeping calm, because test anxiety is real. I mean, there's a lot, depending on what test it was and how much preparation went into it, there's a lot going on there. So really we want to focus on taking deep breaths before starting, making sure our nerves are calm. Also making sure that you started your day off well, right? This includes having a good night's sleep, getting up in the morning and eating a breakfast that is not going to give you gastrointestinal problems or something, right? Like maybe this isn't your Raisin Bran morning, right? Whatever it is you want to do, or dairy doesn't always agree with you. Don't eat yogurt, so eat something that is solid, that has some protein so that your brain can get working. Make sure that you're well hydrated, not like crazy hydrated, but you've well hydrated, you've slept, you've eaten, so that you're ready to approach this test. Deep breaths before starting, calm your nerves. Lots of positive talk. This gets into all my anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy stuff. But lots of positive talk, right? Hey, I'm prepared for this exam. Yeah. I've worked really hard for this. I'm going to go in and I'm going to do my best. This isn't the end of the world. I can always come back, but I'm going to go in here and I'm going to do great, right? So between sections, you might look away for a second, close your eyes for a moment, refocus. Okay, I finished this section. Okay, this one's done. Now let's go ahead and get the next one going. And don't rush, right? Yeah. Don't get frantic. And I think I'm worried that this is what our daughter's going to do on the test. She's going to get a little frantic. So it's really important to understand, and this is hard for the younger kids, and not like the state assessment sheet that our daughter's taking is not that important either way, right? We want her to have the experience of taking a test, but it's not the SATs. But if you've got a student who's taking an exam that is really important, knowing this is how much time I have, this is how many questions there are, and gauging my easy questions should take about a minute and my harder questions could take 3 minutes or whatever, giving them some idea of time blocks so that they're not rushing. If you rush, you're just going to make mistakes.
It's hard to have that internal clock when you're a younger student to know, this test.
Yeah, they're not going to be able to do that.
All right, I'm going to sports analogy. A lot of times with the runners, when they're running around a track or something, they know their pace, right? They know it based on the top, what their foot movements are. It's really hard for our young learners, our third grader's going to go into this test, and is she going to know that she just spent 5 minutes on a question? Yeah. And she just ate up, 5% of her test just on one question. Right. She's not going to know that. And so I think cultivating a good pacing on your practice, I think can get them into a nice rhythm where they can kind of feel like, okay, I got this. And it may require you to observe them taking a short 5-10 minute exam. And you can even just do this passively off to the side, have them do it, at a table. Maybe you're just sitting there off the side and you pretend like you're playing on your phone or something like that, but you're really watching them and you got a timer going and you're seeing how long it takes them to do these questions. And maybe you can help coach them on their pacing from there. And understanding, okay, maybe you spent a little bit too much time here, or I saw you drifting off and staring off. We can't do that. We got to stay locked in. Things like that maybe is something that we as teachers or mentors can help observe in this situation.
Yeah, and I think we need to coach our kids when to just let it go.
Oh yeah.
Hey, you feel like you've been spending time or you're starting to stress. That's the other thing. If you're starting to stress, then that's a real problem. You may need to go on.
Well, and understanding that there's ups and downs through a test, you may run into a difficult stretch of 2 or 3 problems that maybe you have a little challenging, or you didn't know exactly the answer and you're having to work through all your tools and make guesses, can bring your confidence down in that moment. I know when I'm taking a math exam, it's oh, algebra, boom. Oh, this is easy. All of a sudden you get into something and you're a little uncertain about, and then you get another one and another one, and all of a sudden you start to feel like, man, this test is really slowing down. I don't feel like I'm performing. I'm not knowing these information. Do I not know the information? You get a little down. So telling them that sometimes in a test there's going to be these ups and there's going to be these downs. You're going to be running through questions really quick, and there's going to be a few that might slow you down, and just understand that that's normal. And just keep plugging away and keep moving. And you're right. Anything that takes too long, make an educated guess and move on. It doesn't matter. Start if you can, come back at the end, and you can spend a little bit more time on it, but you just don't want it to trip you up and, suck you down into like a mud.
It's true. And avoiding distractions is really hard, especially if you have a very distractible kid. Some exams, like you talked about on the last show, they gave you noise canceling, earmuff things. There's a lot of schools in different places will make accommodations. If you have a very distractible learner, you can oftentimes request that you have, sound noise canceling headphones, or you can bring in, like the kind you use with a lawnmower, chainsaw, or whatever, the big ones.
Sometimes they'll put them in cubicles where they can't see anything,
right.
or they may allow you to turn to the wall or a corner so that you don't get distracted visually.
Don't be afraid to ask for accommodations if you need them. I think that I believe when we send our daughter to school, we should send her with those that we have at home for the test.
The ride-on mower.
The ones we use when there's fireworks and stuff. Yeah, we should just send her with those, because honestly, sound is incredibly distracting to her, as it is to you, which is why you did so well on that test, because you had those on. So if you need an accommodation for your learner, don't be afraid to ask for that, or for them to advocate for themselves that they need something like that. And if the test center can accommodate it, I'm sure that they will.
There's another element there too, that they may feel like they're being watched or reviewed or examined. And I was reiterating to my daughter today that nobody's watching you. Nobody is watching your answers. Nobody's watching you read. You're not having to read out loud. That's something that gives her the most anxiety, is reading out loud to people, because she's afraid of making a mistake in a word and then being embarrassed and all that type of stuff. And I told her there is no reading out loud. It's just quiet reading in your head, answering multiple choice questions that you do on a daily basis. So it's nothing different. So that kind of calmed her down, but she was a little afraid that somebody was going to be staring at her watching, taking the test. I said, nobody's going to be doing this. She was like one teacher in the whole room of like 50 kids, maybe, if I don't even know the accommodations that
they're just going to have somebody in there and make sure the kids don't, get unruly or start sitting together or something. I mean,
exactly,
it's not going to be. So the next section we want to talk about is, what should they do if they do not know the answer to a question? Well, the first thing is eliminate the ones that are obviously wrong. There's usually a couple that are just like, you could probably go, there's, if you have any idea at all about the question, there's probably a couple that are just like throwaways, right? Then try to use context clues that are in the reading comprehension, right? So you can show there's some great examples online. You can, look this up. Like, if you're going to have to read a short paragraph and answer reading comprehension questions, how can you look for keywords in that paragraph that you had to read that help you answer the question? The other thing for math is you can plug in the remaining answer choices and see if they would work. So I've done this many times. So you plug in the answer and you kind of work backwards a little bit and see if it's possible. Like you were talking about, is that a realistic number? Or I was talking about, is this the right magnitude? That's one of the things you can do if your child doesn't know. So they can plug that in and kind of work backwards and go, oh, that isn't possible. That one couldn't be it, if they have time for it. And then make an educated guess and move on. As you said earlier, there's a chance you're going to go towards the end of the exam and something is going to click, or something that comes up later in the exam is going to jog your memory, or whatever it is. So if there's no penalty for wrong answers, don't leave it blank.
Exactly. Yeah. Try to just fill it in. And sort of going back to what you said earlier, if you do run out of time, you're going to be very thankful that you made an educated guess before. Because if you think about it, let's say you did 50 questions and you had to guess on 10 and you were really confident on 40. In those 10, maybe you got half of them right. Now you got 45 out of 50. That's a great score. It's a 90, right? Yeah. If you didn't fill in those 10, you just left them blank. Now you got an 80, right? And that's the difference. It's a 10-point gap there just by guessing. And even if you got most of them wrong and you only got one or two, well, those are a couple questions you picked up.
to play outside my comfort zone, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Said
Gretzky, wasn't it?
No, wasn't that
I
from the
thought it was Gretzky.
wasn't that from I know, but it wasn't that from The Office where he it was Wayne Gretzky and Michael Scott crossed it out and put Michael Scott beneath it.
I'm just saying, I'm not the sports analogy person, but it was perfect. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about is reviewing the answers before submitting. Yeah. So we talked about this just briefly, but just to reiterate, we want to always double check our work if our time allows. Looking for, did I accidentally skip a question? Mm-hmm. Were there any just really careless math errors? I was moving too quickly. Did I follow all the directions carefully enough? Read the directions again. I have done this on some of my MBA level tests where I realized I didn't read the directions properly, and it was something like you said, like a knot instead of I have done that before, and by checking at the end, I caught that kind of stuff. So we're not looking to change a bunch of answers. Typically, our first answer that we came up with is usually the right one. If we second guess ourselves too many times, oftentimes we actually make a mistake. So we're not looking to change a bunch of answers and, scrutinize everything. We're just trying to take a kind of a look at each one and like a sanity check. Did I read the directions right? Did I just do some stupid math thing that I need to correct? Did I read the directions properly?
Especially on something you were uncertain about at the first time, like when you were in that problem. But I bet you there is some study out there that says, your first answer is correct 70% of the time. I bet you they've done these studies.
They have. Your first answer is usually. And one of the other things to be really careful about is the bubbling. Did you fully do the bubble? Did you half do the bubble? Did you write a check mark or an X, or accidentally there's some writing in a second bubble on the same line? Yeah, right. So the Scantron stuff you have to be pretty careful with.
Do these kids even take Scantrons anymore?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I think all the tests that our school does are not on computers, so how else would you test hundreds of children? You've got to do something like Scantron.
I don't know.
But I'm guessing it's something like that. When I took all my professional exams...
That's how out of touch we are, us homeschoolers.
My professional exams just a few years ago were all Scantron. So
were they? Okay.
All right. So the next thing we want to talk about is what to do if we don't pass this test.
Yep.
Which I think it's a tough thing, right? We always want to think we're going to pass, but first we need to reassure our kids that this test does not define them. It doesn't define their abilities, their intelligence. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily define this one test. Maybe doesn't define how well they're going to do in their career or their options. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of ways to get there again. You can take the test again. If it's only a one-time test, then maybe there's a different school they can go to that they can, if we're talking about getting into colleges and things. Like, we just don't want them to put all of their self-worth on this one silly exam, because there's some brilliant people out there that are terrible test takers.
Well, and it's a lot of times we put a lot of weight on a certain type of test, like what you said. But that test, I can almost guarantee them it's not going to be their last. And there's always going to be another test, and there's always going to be another test. And then even just in life, there's always going to be the next test. And, how you handle the failures, I think, is more important than how you handle the successes. Can you pick yourself up and move forward? I agree with you, especially with these standardized tests here in the homeschooling community. They're not as important to us. No. They're us, maybe passively for us as homeschoolers, trying to validate internal fears that we have as home educators and not doing enough or all that type of stuff. Maybe it factors more into our minds than it should into like an early elementary student. It shouldn't really factor at all. My daughter was a little worried. She goes, "Daddy, what if I don't do well?" I said, "Doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter."
I mean, for the most part,
to me, I want her to do well.
Sure.
I want her to perform well, and I want her to have that. I want her to have that good feelings. I know what it feels like for her to succeed. I've seen her do it.
Well, and we want her to have the experience, because this testing now and the next few years doesn't really matter. I mean, obviously it matters for the state and the scores and all that stuff, but really for us is this doesn't really matter. But she's going to be taking, in the future, she's going to be taking harder tests. Yep. When by the time she gets to her PSATs and that kind of stuff, we don't want it to be the first time she sat in front of a standardized test, so that she's ready and she knows how to approach it and how to be successful. And we're training that through all the previous tests. So if we're going to look at like, how do we become better test takers if they don't get the score they want or they didn't pass the test is really to analyze the results. Were there any weak areas that you can specifically identify? And if you can, was it like a knowledge gap? Did you just misunderstand the test format? Was it because they didn't have time? I mean, really trying to understand if you can. I mean, you know, when I didn't pass my professional engineering exam, it was just like fail. They didn't really give me anything.
When you didn't know how close to the edge you were.
I didn't know how close I was. I just knew fail, which was really hard, right? I didn't have, but I kind of knew. And one of the things
But did they have like a high number that year? Like,
oh yeah, that was a total crazy thing. It was like a pendulum swing. Like one year, everybody passed, like 100% of the naval architects passed. And so the next year, only like 20% of them passed because they realized, they were like, oh, this test is too easy. So they made it super hard and then only 20% passed. And they went, oh, shoot, we overshot. And then the next year, there was like 60% that passed. Anyway, one of the things you can do, because some of the tests are not going to give you much in the way of diagnostics, I found that it's really helpful to get out of the exam and write some notes down. Just jot down your thoughts right afterwards. I felt really good about this section. Ooh, I felt really stressed about this section, or this section felt more uncomfortable, or I'm not sure about these, or whatever. Write some really quick notes, because chances are your exam results are going to come significantly after you took that exam. Sometimes it could be months. I think when I took my professional engineering, it was like 3 months.
I know,
so
just sat there on pins and needles.
Right.
Yeah.
By the time you get your results, you don't remember why, you know, which sections. And if they don't give you any diagnostics, you're kind of like left without a path and a plan to retake. So jot down some notes if they can. And then we need to use this as a learning experience. So what went really well? What can we improve on? You know, can we adjust our study strategies if we can take the test again? You know, and if it's not something we're going to take again, it was just an assessment, like our daughter's going to this assessment, we'll find out what her score's like later. We'll look at those weak areas and we'll just try to identify how can we reinforce those weak areas over time so that the next test that she goes into in a few years, she performs better, she feels more confident about, etc. And we really need to watch the mindset of our kids too, right? Because we talked about we don't want their self-worth to be defined by test scores. But we need to discuss how, like, even professionals and adults, and we are both great examples of this, face tests. We face setbacks in our lives. It's normal to not always succeed.
Projects miss schedules. We can't get the presentation together. We do the presentation in front of the CEO and he denies the funding for the business unit, or you know, you didn't realize that you were going to be made an example of, and you feel failure. But
right, and not all these are fair situations, by the way, at all. But they are real. They happen.
So many times you're put into an unwinnable situation, and you're
Kobayashi Maru.
You're in the Kobayashi Maru, and you can't just unplug the game. And it's okay. You take the hits, and you know, you go out and you do it again, and that's just what you do. And yeah, that's something I think I'd never really appreciated that, because it was always the weight of getting the right answers and getting the scores. And then when you finally get into the real world and you start going through the I think, the life is the Kobayashi Maru. And you're constantly getting hit by things and you're constantly failing. And you start to realize after a while that you're meant to fail, because that's the way to get there. I know in the tech world, it's just failure all the way down. And then eventually you reach, you don't realize that you're failing down, but you're actually failing up to where you need to go.
Well, I mean, it's all a learning process. Setbacks,
always.
Failures are a normal part of, you know, of growth, right? of growth. And so we need our kids to know that that's okay, you know? So if we're going to take the test again, then now we know the results we got. Let's make a plan. Maybe we're going to adjust the study habits or get some different test taking materials that, or, you know, maybe you found like, oh, well, that book wasn't very good. I had this happen on my engineering exam. I was like, well, I was using the wrong book. I'm going to switch it. I'm going to use that over there. Maybe your strategy was wrong. Like, I had notebooks that I brought into the exam. I didn't work out as many practice problems as I should have. I adjusted that for the next time. I said, okay, I'm going to work a million practice problems. I'm going to bring them all in with me because the test seems to ask similar questions year after year. So I'm going to do that, right? So maybe you need to adjust your strategies. If test anxiety was the problem, then, you know, we need to focus on building confidence and some other coping mechanisms to use during the test to keep ourselves calm so that they can perform better on
or
the
learning
test.
You know, asking, having the wherewithal to ask if there are other accommodations that could be made, especially if we have students who have maybe ADHD or something that allow an untimed exam where they get more breaks and they can break and come back. Sometimes we don't even know what we're allowed to ask for.
Yes.
That can help our learners move forward. And I think just by taking the test and asking those questions, they're going to, a lot of times the schools will bend over backwards to assist you. And there's a lot of opportunities that we don't even know because we don't even ask for it. We just assume, well, we just have to do what everybody else is doing. And that's not the case.
Right. There are definitely opportunities. I think overall, we just need to focus our kids on the fact that progress is what's important.
100%.
It's not being perfect.
Yeah. It's the process. It's all the process.
It's all the process, and that growth comes out of difficult situations like this. So hopefully these strategies will be helpful, especially if you have a learner who's taking a more advanced test. These are just kind of standard test taking strategies, but
these apply from the third grade test that she's about to take all the way up to an AP or entrance exam to college.
Yes,
and
AP
stuff like
exam
that.
would be a great example of this too. Yeah, and obviously the younger they are, the less some of this stuff matters because the results of that test matter less to us than the results of these higher level tests, especially if our students have worked really hard to take that AP test or whatever it is.
There's a lot weighing on those. Like an AP is a great example. It's you get a good enough score on that, you don't have to you get credits for that for college. Like you get a 5 on.
Deal.
I got 5 on AP calc exams, and I got credit for those, and I didn't have to pay for those classes, and I got full credit for them. I had one where I scored like a 3 on it, and they said, well, we're not going to give you credit, but you don't have to take it. You don't have to take the class, but we're not going to give you credit for it. So I had to go make up credits elsewhere. And
just a reminder that you do not need to take an AP class to take an AP exam. You just have to pay for it. So something that I think AP classes are kind of, we have some friends whose kids are taking them at the high school. And I think AP classes are really a raw deal because you spend all year doing college level work and then you take an exam. And if you don't get a high enough score, you don't get college level credit, which is just like, you'd be better off taking a community college level class or just do the work and then take the AP exam. And if that doesn't work out, you could always take it again. But just know, I guess that's the other thing. If you take an AP class and you take the AP exam afterwards and it doesn't go great, you're not a senior yet. Take it again the next year, right?
100%. This happened in my AP physics class in high school, and my professor, there was only like 6 of us in the class, and we took the AB and the BC. I think we took both mechanics and the electromagnetic exam. So we bundled them all into one class, and I took that at the end of the year. Scored well on the first one, the mechanics, not as well on the E&M, but I can honestly tell you, I didn't face a class that was harder than that until my junior year in college when I walked into my quantum class for the first time. All my other classes were at the same par, and you're right. Like, you're sitting here taking an AP classes, college level in high school.
Yep.
It's just not fair that you don't get credit for that in college, and you got to go ahead and do it again. If you're trying to, get out of languages, or if you're an English major or something like that, and you're like, oh, I don't do well in testing, but I write killer papers. It's just not fair, right? Sometimes it's kind of weird. Like, the test doesn't align with the performance. It's sort of like we've watched a lot of cooking shows. It's like a really good chef. The constraints that they're put on in the TV shows isn't really necessarily the same thing that you're going to see in the restaurant or something like that. It's like, you've got 30 minutes and here's some fantasy, ingredients, make whatever.
You've never cooked with alligator before. Here you go.
That's not realistic. Like, they've got a well-honed recipe and method and kitchen and style, and they're able to produce exactly what they need to produce. And maybe they have weeks and time to prepare for new recipes and stuff. It's just not the same. So like, if you have a student who writes amazingly well, like really good writer, and then they got to get into a test and they have 45 minutes to write an essay, and they're not really good at cranking out an essay in 45 minutes. They're more of a slower paced writer, and they have to revise and whatnot. It's just not fair to that's not an evaluation of how good they are,
That's true.
And so sometimes the tests select for exactly what the test selects for with respect to the examination. And this maybe goes to if you're talking to your learner, if they don't perform as well, but they're really good at that thing, that the test selects for exactly what the test selects for, and you're a great writer, and your writing method doesn't necessarily mean that you're a great test-taking writer, but that it's not a reflection on you and your quality. We just have to understand that. So like, I think keeping that in perspective, I think is a really strong thing. And it's just understanding the test is not always the be end and end all. It's a path. Sometimes it's a step we have to get over. It's a hurdle. Like I don't do well on tests. Standardized tests, you scored better on the SATs than I did and everything.
Yeah, well, that's what you say, but you did very well in your teaching exams. So.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
So anyways, we digress, but hopefully this helps you and your learner in your upcoming testing, and hopefully these are good episodes to revisit when you have tests come up in the future. Thanks so much for joining us today and making us a part of your homeschool journey. Please engage with us on social media. Join our Homeschool Together podcast group on Facebook and find us at Homeschool Together Podcast on Instagram. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions, and recommendations. Until next time,
Happy homeschooling!